Welcome to you all to the Enabling Future Auckland Symposium. My name is David McConnell, and as Deputy Chair of the Committee for Auckland, I'm your host today. Many of you will be familiar with the committee. It's done some great things over a number of years since its birth back in about year 2000, particularly around its leadership in catalysing the change to Auckland governance as we know it. And thank you all for attending today. We live in a very exciting time, in fact quite extraordinary. Never have we seen such transformation of how Auckland is led. For the first time, many Aucklanders now have visibility into our future and are growing in confidence that a better future can possibly be achieved. The transformation that Auckland is currently going through actually has the promise of setting up an economic transformation, a revolution that has been experienced by only a few cities in the world. It is quite a unique time. We have moved through the amalgamation process with a surprising efficiency. The reorganisation of Auckland Council over the last 3 years, or 4 years, has been very well planned, and I would say it's exceeded many of our expectations. We stand at the beginning of what is the most unbelievable opportunity. It is not just for Aucklanders' benefit, but more importantly for New Zealanders' benefit. We have the necessary focus, we have an excellent platform, in particular being ranked high in the livability index in the world, and most importantly we are in demand. People and talent want to come to Auckland. We see it. And both Arthur and Oliver, I hope, will talk about the importance of this potential population growth. We are in demand. It's actually a leader's dream. This excitement, however, I sense is a step away from reality. I believe we all feel a sense of constraint, a sense that we don't have the confidence and capacity to accelerate the key initiatives that will allow us to take hold of this opportunity. It's like taking on the America's Cup, thinking that you are going to win with a half-funded campaign and a second-hand vote. Such an opportunity available to us with such an opportunity being available to us, shouldn't we be ramping up our strategic initiatives and capitalising on the growing private sector's confidence? Instead, I sense we feel constrained and somewhat compromised. Why do we find ourselves in this predicament? For guidance, I returned to Greg Clark's wise counsel 6 years ago. I hope I do this justice, Greg. When he headed up the OECD review of Auckland, this was before the Royal Commission, he focused his advice on 4 absolutely essential priorities. 1 plan, empowered leadership, a single point of execution, and 4th, appropriate incentivised funding model. We have nailed the first 3. We have nailed, I believe, the 1 plan. We have empowered leadership. We do have a much more efficient execution base, a single point of execution. However, the last of these has not been addressed, that being an appropriate incentivised funding model. And I believe this is the primary cause for the sense of constraint we now face. Personally, I don't know how much of the problem of the funding model can be attributed to our own thinking within Auckland Council and the sphere of influence we have, or how much of it is a central government issue, in particular whether the current rates-based funding model provides the appropriate incentives for cities like Auckland to invest appropriately for greater economic and social prosperity. At a council level, why isn't there the necessary financial plan included as part of the Auckland plan, showing the likely return and increased rates to the council if we achieve the predicted population growth based off the investment that's been planned? Maybe we can afford to accelerate investment and take on more debt. Why does the government default to a generic funding formula of 50-50 in infrastructure and economic initiatives, given that the tax benefits of these hugely favours the government? Event funding is just one example of this. Should government be shifting on from a one-size-fits-all approach to all New Zealand to recognising the capability and opportunity with its super cities, both today and in the future? It's important that all stakeholders here and other stakeholders who are party to these discussions do not see this as a criticism. Rather, the natural process to optimise the benefits of this new paradigm of super cities. This is not going to be just an Auckland issue, but a whole New Zealand will have to be engaged in this, or we see other metro cities or metro areas start to amalgamate in the future. There are a number of financial instruments that get bandied around, like PPPs. However, these can only be employed if we have the confidence that we have increased income in the future to pay for their amortised cost. The amalgamation of Auckland has allowed us to attract excellent talent to our cities in terms of our management and governance, and it's important that we address the funding model to really empower this leadership. So I hope today will provide the first critical step by working together to better understand and help solve this dilemma. We've got a great lineup of individuals who are close to the action and can give their perspectives. It's a great pleasure to have here Greg Clark, back to Auckland, arguably the world expert on cities and their economies. We're privileged to have Joe Brosnahan as our moderator, someone who has had to deal with both the theory and pragmatics of local government. We have Andrew McKenzie from Auckland City, Treasury's Jane Francis, Arthur Grimes, who needs little in the way of introduction, Becca's Amelia Vasey, and Duncan Southwell, head of the advisory at BNZ. We have Jean-Pierre Rad, CEO of NZ Institute of Economic Research, and Oliver Hartwich, who heads up the New Zealand Initiative. We're the Chief Policy Advisor to Local Government, Mike Reid, and Ernest Young's partner, Grant Hodges. You could not get a better lineup. But most importantly, we actually have you. You are here to contribute. This is a symposium and not a lecture. And we'll all work together today to build an agenda and the momentum to take this forward. Now it gives me great pleasure to invite to the stage Professor Greg Clark. He has been Chairman of OECD Forum for Cities and Regions and a Global Fellow at Brookings, just to name a few of his roles. He knows intimately more than 100 cities in the world. Most importantly, has he been a great friend to Auckland, advisor to the Metropan and to the Royal Commission on Auckland Governance. Welcome, Greg.
David, thank you very much indeed. Good morning to you. Good morning to everyone. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here again. Some of you know I was just here about 4 weeks ago, and it's certainly the fastest return visit I've ever done. But the good news is it means that lots is fresh in my mind. Let me just thank the Committee for Auckland for the invitation to be here. It's not the first time I've been a participant in a gathering convened by the Committee for Auckland, and not on today's agenda, but I think it's very important to remember that the cities that most successfully navigate change are often the cities that have vibrant business and civic leadership groups that are able to act as a partner of government, as a pace setter, as an interlocutor between the local and the national. And I think the Committee for Auckland has done a terrific job in that over a long period of time. And I think it's one of the reasons you have been able to make so much progress. So thank you to the committee. It's great to be here with all of you. There are many people in the room who I know. I hope to have a chance to talk to you during the course of today. Now, I think my job is to start to stimulate the conversation. And I know this is designed to be a conversation today. So in order to do that, I'll go quite quickly through some of the things I want to say to you, and that will leave time for the other things that we want to say to each other. Let's just find where my slides are. Here we go. What I'm going to try to talk about is this, the role of investment in Auckland's future, and we're going to try to isolate the question of capital investment. Why is that important to cities? I'll be trying to answer the question, how can cities increase their investment rate and why do cities try to do that? And in particular, there will be sort of three dimensions to this. One, making better use of existing assets, revenues and programs. All cities have them. How do you make them count? Two, raising additional resources through new instruments and tools. Which instruments, which tools? How do you make the case for them? How do you choose them? How do you create an agreement with government about them? And then three, how do you become more attractive and visible to external capital, something where you already have an initiative in train that I think you need to back. I'll be giving you a lot of examples of what other cities have done, and I'll be offering some thoughts of my own on what Auckland should do or could do, and who should do it, and trying to give you a bit of a perspective there. So the first thing to say is that, as David has already better described than I think cities in the current moment, in this global age that we appear to be trying to do three things. One thing is to improve their governance and leadership, and in particular to reform or align governance with the geography of problems, with the assets and the capital resources, and with the mega trends. In other words, if you inherit a governmental system which isn't fit for purpose, you do have to put it right. If you don't put it right, you can't in the end affect change or shape the future. They're about building better plans and strategies. David's talked about that. And they're also about increasing the investment rate in cities. And as he said, it appears to me that Auckland is well on the way to doing 1 and 2, but there appears to have been so far only limited discussion of number 3. And I remember when I was advisor to the Royal Commission on the future of Auckland governance, the whole issue of financing was explicitly ruled out from that review. And of course there were obviously good reasons to do that at the time, because other reviews were in train and new arrangements had just been crystallised. But with some hindsight, maybe now is the time to have another look at the financing piece of all of that. I studiously track what's happening to the top sort of 1,000 cities in the world, and the way I do that is by reviewing all of the benchmark studies, the comparative reviews, the indexes. And this allows us to observe, I think, the emerging and changing global system of cities. So I've spent a lot of time recently looking at the established world cities, the Londons and the New Yorks and the Hong Kongs and the Tokyos. And then I became very interested in what I would call the emerging world cities, the Shanghais, the Sao Paulos, the Mumbais. And for many years I was coming to Auckland and talking to you, and people were saying, well, how do we compare with London and New York? And I was saying, well, doesn't seem like quite the right comparison. So I've started to pay attention to a third group of cities that I'd like to call today the high quality of life cities. These are smaller cities. I'll be talking a little bit about them in a minute. And they're cities who compete on the basis of their livability, which is clearly part of Auckland's offer. We'll talk a bit about that. There are also other groups of cities beginning to emerge, obviously the comeback cities. We're beginning to be able to look much more at the national systems of cities and how they perform as a whole, and which national systems are more productive or more efficient than the others. And we can talk about all of that. But if you look at all of these benchmark studies in 2013 and 2014, and if you want to read the 400-page report of the 157 benchmarks, go to the Jones Lang LaSalle Global Research website where the report is. 5 kind of stories emerge as being critical issues facing cities at the moment. One is about quality, both in the emerging and the established cities. There's a real flight towards trying to achieve urban quality. Cost is no longer, of course, the differentiator. There's this group of middleweight cities, many of which are the high quality of life cities, and I would characterise Auckland as a competitive middleweight high quality of life city, which are beginning to develop a model of success which is different from those of the other groups of cities. Fiscal capacity and investment friendliness is becoming a huge differentiator for cities. It started to matter much more how bankable, how investment ready, how open to capital, how responsive the fiscal systems are of cities in terms of how they shape and engage with external opportunities, but also the internal development process. So this is becoming a means through which we can compare cities, and I'm going to show you some comparisons in a minute. In other words, fiscal capacity, investment friendliness, fiscal nimbleness is now one of the ingredients of comparative performance of cities. Yeah? We've also got this move from the smart city agenda of 5 years ago to the resilient city conversation. We could talk about that. And then new paths into global success. One of the big changes since the financial crisis is that you no longer have to be a headquarters town or a financial hub in order to be a successful global city. You can be a global city in science and technology and medicine, or in media and creative industries, or you can be a global city these days by being a centre of diplomacy of one kind or another. So the models of success have broadened and diversified, and all of this, I think, is good news for Auckland. Many of these things point in the direction in which Auckland is headed. A parallel process has been the urbanisation of global businesses. That just as cities have started to globalize, so global businesses have started to urbanize and re-urbanize. And there's a global phenomena that's very visible of companies coming back to cities, looking for city centre locations, looking to employ workforces that live in city centres, looking to use cities as partners in innovation, partners in branding, thinking more about multi-ethnic, multi-racial labour forces within cities as contributing to producing products and services that are fit for a global market. All of that re-urbanisation of global business is going on, and that has a number of themes and trends to it that become important over this period of time, and I think enable us to see something of the future of where these agendas will go. At the same time, there's a lot of new data available on fiscal flows, capital analytics, which deals and transactions are being done where, the emergence of alternative assets within the fund management industry, the interests of particularly the insurance companies, the pension funds, and investing in hard assets, whether it's real estate or it's infrastructure. This is all changing the way in which we look at the global dynamics of capital flows into cities, and it's part of that process of cities becoming much more competitive. And within this framework, these high quality of life cities emerge as a very interesting group. Now, the model of success for these cities, I think, is one, achieving high quality of livability. That, in a sense, is their endowment. That's what they bring. But it's to marry that with good management of population growth, because they're all attracting population, as David said earlier, and to combine that with a new economy, an economy which links with their high quality of life and is focused, of course, on entrepreneurship and innovation, new sectors, new processes and products, focused on combining that attractive visitor and resident livability with something that's also productive, is able to trade. In order for that to work, they have to overcome smallness of size by having a strong identity and good connectivity. They have to be able to build specialization in a number of sectors where they can be globally competitive. They have to be able to achieve some kind of productivity and efficiency in terms of their business operations. So these high quality of life cities have a model of success that's beginning to emerge. Within this group of cities, Auckland has an interesting position, because I'm taking the 25 most livable cities in the world across the sort of 10 benchmark reports. And what you can observe, first of all, is that Auckland's got the smallest economy of them. So it's, but it's the 17th most globalized. So the US cities and the Canadian cities have very high quality of life, but are not necessarily as globalized as Auckland. One of the benefits of being remote and being the big city in a small nation is that you have to globalize. And so although you feel the pressure of Auckland's apparently remote location, actually there's certain advantages to having the international outlook that it requires you to have, and we'll come back to that. And then you can see within this, it's the third largest finance and business service sector, because it's the corporate hub of New Zealand, and therefore there are benefits there. But if you look at the per capita income, for example, Auckland is relatively low in comparison to a couple of others here. We'll come on to some more of this. Now, these high quality of life cities are adopting a particular set of strategies for the future. I've already summarised what most of them are. Just look at the fifth one. Competing for investment in infrastructure, real estate, technology and FDI is really a key part. And it's this group of cities that are becoming now the key new markets for much of the international mobile capital. And that's critical for you, not just from the point of view of foreign direct investment or sovereign wealth investment, but also institutional capital into government debt and into other government-backed vehicles. They've also begun, I think, to develop a set of initiatives around both public investment and private investment. I'll be giving you some case studies later on, so I won't labour it here. But that wide range of financial tools that David referred to earlier, and you've all, of course, heard about, are very much being employed by different ones of these cities according to what they think is going to work for them. So there's a bit of a new era emerging. For most of these cities, the investment rate has really started to matter. Firstly, because of the renewed intensity of competition. This current cycle of globalization is making competition, I think, more intense, but within certain niches and groups and networks of cities. And that competition is not just around how to be livable, but also how to turn livability into a return on investment. And there'll be an important point to make, I think, about different notions of livability. We'll come back to this later on. These cities clearly have potential, and therefore there's an issue about whether they perform to potential or whether they underperform. And investment and the investment rate seems to be very critical, given that most of these cities are experiencing population growth. Growth management nearly always requires investment, particularly in infrastructure, housing, city systems and other things. That's critical to successful growth management. Many of these cities also have to adjust from an old economy to a new economy, and this means the reorientation of infrastructure systems, changes in land use patterns, the renewal of buildings from one function into another. That process of conversion or adaptation or re-engineering the city, whatever you like to call it, is a capital-intensive process. So the ability of cities to do it well depends upon how they deploy capital towards it. Of course, they face risks and costs. The biggest risk is that you have a growth in population without a growth in jobs. A growth in population without a growth in jobs causes serious challenges in these cities. It erodes livability, of course, very quickly. Cities get stuck sometimes in lock-in, sometimes in processes of decline, and it's often an investment boost that gets them out of that. And then, of course, cities and regions, as I was saying earlier, have become markets for businesses. So in many ways, this investment rate really matters in terms of how they compete. How does it matter? Investment plays a role in what I would call the operating platform within a city, both for business and the platform for people. How productive, efficient, easy the city is to operate in is a function of things like infrastructure, business climate, underpinning city systems. We've already said it plays a key role in sustainability of growth and management of growth. The financial system is also part of the business climate of a city. How the taxation system works, what it appears to promote and appears to penalise, what it incentivises and what it disincentivizes as a financial system is part of the business climate and makes a city either more or less business friendly, more or less investment ready. The speed of adjustment of the urban fabric we've referred to. The ability of cities to integrate their systems depends, of course, upon the span of control of a city government. So to be absolutely simplistic about this, it's easier for a city like a Singapore or a Hong Kong, that we'll see some data around in a minute, where the city government has control over everything. It's easier to be smart because you're doing a process of internal integration within one governance system. If you're in a city, let's take Dublin, just to keep the comparisons a little bit anonymous, where the local government has a very small span of control and very limited resources, it's very difficult to be smart because you've got to integrate systems that are outside of the city government into a smart agenda. Of course, value creation and value capture are key parts of how you manage growth. If you get transport and planning and housing right, you can use population growth to generate value, not just in land, but also in city systems. You can capture and recycle that value. And then finally, if you have investment deficits or investment gaps, the competitive climate we're in makes them increasingly visible to the outside world. So if a city is carrying an infrastructure system which is incomplete, or if it has a superb airport but it doesn't have high-speed access to it, or if it has land that is vacant within what are the prime markets of the city, these investment blights, investment deficits or investment gaps create negative perceptions around that city, which communicate very actively to investors. They act as signals to the marketplace. So this is how the investment rate within a city and the investment system matters to how a city performs. The race for investment is on. You don't need me to talk to you about the high-tech race, the FDI race, the real estate race for investment. We could do the sovereign wealth fund race. We could do all sorts of others. But all cities are now competing for these different kinds of capital and trying to optimize their position within it. Since the global financial crisis, there are some big changes that I think we can map as trends. Firstly, we've seen the decline of some of the traditional financing tools that cities used in the 2 or 3 business cycles up to 2008. There's less tax base around for a number of reasons, and there's less willingness, I think, or there's less ease in raising tax or proposing new taxes. There are fewer transfer payments. National governments and national treasuries have tended to consolidate their tax in particular positions. There's fewer grant aid systems available. There's less easy debt. There's been less, until recently, speculative development. Fewer ways to finance small projects. The old model that many cities used for financing urban development is in various ways challenged. It's a quick summary of it. On the other hand, we've seen the return of some financial instruments that were used extensively 2 cycles ago: tax incentives, enterprise zones, job subsidies, special taxes applied to particular kinds of transactions, a new generation of public-private partnerships with new regimes around them, a huge growth in user charges as the ways of financing infrastructure investment. These are the trends in other countries. I'm not talking about New Zealand. We've also seen the rise of some new instruments, reforms and consolidations within government. I don't go to a city now and not discover that they've done some kind of consolidation of who does what within their governance system, so that there's increasing degrees of complementary specialization between governmental entities. As I say, user charges on the up, value capture mechanisms for financing things increasing. The role of international financial institutions has hugely grown in the last 10 years. The World Bank, the Asia Development Bank and others becoming much more involved in this activity. Project bonds, as it were, non-guaranteed, non-sovereign bonds directed to securing the physical assets of particular projects as a way of proceeding. You know about the growth of sovereign wealth funds and private equity, capital flexibility, public equity and land deals increasing, and some new fiscal responsibilities. So there's a big new set of tools. And most of these require cities to behave in ways they haven't had to behave before. Most of them require cities to become more erudite, more capable in terms of corporate finance, and they require political leaders to become braver, and they require politicians at different levels of government to be able to negotiate joint ventures with each other in one way or another. We've also seen the rise of set of new investment plans that I think have been very important. So that's the backdrop. That's the kind of the context in which this conversation in Auckland, I think, is happening, that we see changed fiscal and financial systems for cities where investment rate is becoming much more important in an increasingly competitive environment, and where the high quality of life cities are now competing with each other for their particular niches, and where investment in the livability platform becomes key. Let's just look, if we may, for a minute at Auckland's financial system. And again, this is an outside-in view. You'll get much better data, I'm sure, from Andrew later on. But let me tell you what I see, looking from the outside. Firstly, if you look at the New Zealand financial system, what you see is that government spending as a percentage of GDP is about 40%. That's a little bit smaller than the OECD average, not substantially, 4 or 5 percentage points. In other words, New Zealand tends to do a little bit less through its public sector than most of the rest of the OECD countries do. 90% of all public revenues are controlled by central government, as opposed to 51% across the OECD. Now, I'm not making any judgments about whether that's good or bad. We'll have to talk about that. And highly centralized fiscal systems have their advantages, which I'm sure we'll discuss later on as well. But on the whole, what you would say here is New Zealand is an outlier, and I will show you later on some comparative data that shows you who's in the same bracket as New Zealand. Health, education, police and other things, including a significant part of the housing investment, are all centralised. That's quite unusual for an OECD member country. So quite a centralised system of government and finance. And then in Auckland, total government spending is about $16,000 per capita per year. You'll see that that's a bit below the average, but not substantially. Annual budget of $3.2 billion. This is all in New Zealand dollars, from a total national spending of 28 to 29 billion, and then a capital program, 1.6 billion, 50% of the total, much of that in transport and water. So this is, as it were, Auckland's share of the national system. Now, if you compare Auckland's financial system to that of London, New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, Paris and Tokyo, these are the top 6 cities in the world. In all sort of comparative tables. A number of things, I think, become clear from doing this. And bear in mind, I don't think these are the best comparators for Auckland. But you notice, firstly, that the Auckland Council budget is incredibly small in relation to the others. It's only similar in size here, really, to Paris, and it's still a quarter of that size. And this is not Greater Paris. This is the small central arrondissement of Paris. Yeah? So the budget's very small. The next thing I would look at here particularly is the city government budget per capita. If you look at that at $1,700 US and then you compare it across, you'll see the gap. If you look at then the two figures towards the bottom, proportion of city budget raised and held locally, 90%. In other words, the Auckland City Council is really quite self-financing, quite self-dependent. There aren't a huge number of transfers from national government. And then the final number, 11%, that the Auckland Council is in charge of 11% of the public sector investment into Auckland. So 89% is under the control of central government. Just look across, you'll see the comparators. Yeah? So you've got a city council. I know you call Auckland a super city, but it's small by international standards. Yeah? You've got a budget that's small. You've got low per capita investment rate, a high level of self-dependency, or let's put it another way, 2 almost separate fiscal systems, where the council system and the central government's fiscal system are almost completely separate from each other, not a high level of cross-investment, not a large number of joint ventures, and then a hugely controlling central government in relation to that. Look at Auckland against the high quality of life cities, the group I'm saying are a more relevant set of comparators. And what you see, of course, is the same story, except that if you look at the high quality of life cities and their kind of city government budget per capita or their average levels of investment, actually they're even higher than the world cities. So the competitors that Auckland if Auckland is going to be the most livable city in the world, these are the other contenders to be the most livable cities in the world. And their rate of investment is 3, 4, 5 times higher than Auckland's. That's really the point. Now, no need to be depressed, because there's lots we can do about this. But if you ask then the question, well, which are the other places around the world where the system is as centralised as that in New Zealand? Well, I did find 2. And they're Albania and Greece, where the system is more centralised. But Cuba is much more liberal. I did try to find out where North Korea was, but the data wasn't easily available for that. But obviously, New Zealand has in common with Ireland and the United Kingdom, and of course, to a certain extent, Canada and Australia, but they're federal systems, so that's different. But it's inherited the UK Treasury approach to public finances. And the point here, of course, is that in this environment, coupled with the particular kinds of challenges faced, you have to ask whether this is the right fiscal system for the challenges that you have at the moment. We'll come back to all of that. Overall, how is Auckland doing? Let's try to race ahead a little bit now. I said that Auckland does very well as a sort of leader for resident livability, and you can see here that in one of the studies Auckland's the 3rd in the world, in another one it's the 10th, in another one it's 11th. Don't spend all your time looking at the single index in which Auckland scores the highest. Try to look at the ones where there's a bit of challenge, because that will help you. If you walk around saying Auckland's the 3rd most livable city in the world, you'll miss the point, okay? And I'm saying this as a friend. Many other cities scoring extremely well. Now, the point I would like to make is this, that these measures of livability measure, to my mind, two very different notions of livability. One notion of livability is these superb environmental assets, this beautiful scenery, these wonderful natural assets, this sense of how amazing that we have a place like this and I own my little piece of it. Yeah? And those are the measures of livability, a quite personal kind of livability, a private relationship between people and the environment, where Auckland scores very high. If you take other ideas about livability, culture, arts, urban buzz, shared amenities, amenities that improve as population grows, Auckland doesn't score so well. In other words, the model of livability that you're backing at the moment is one that's about using your environmental assets to create a quality of life experience for individuals that can afford it. It's not about building up a stock of shared assets and opportunities which improve quality of life for large groups of people and get better as the population grows and the tax revenues raise. So I want you to, as it were, feel that challenge, if you don't mind. It's got acknowledged strengths in knowledge, which is a key part of the model of success for livable cities, but at the moment, not a strong performance in terms of the commercialization of knowledge and turning knowledge into enterprise and trading companies and everything else. Relatively well-connected city because of the aviation system, the big improvements that you've made in digital infrastructure, but not a strong player in global networks and exchanges of capital, ideas, human capital flows, etc. A city that's got patchy global appeal. People who know Auckland really love it. People who don't know Auckland have no idea what Auckland is. It doesn't project an image outside of the personal relationship. Perceptions of quality, as I said, but little perception of buzz. No sense of excitement, dynamism here. Absence of business brand, investor brand. The idea that there's a return on investment in Auckland is not clear to people. And although there is a big infrastructure program in train, and the benefits of that are not coming through yet in the indexes and the rankings and the benchmark studies, there's a perception that the infrastructure has a big room for improvement. Here's a little summary looking at Auckland across a dozen indexes rather than just one or two. So you can see the infrastructure deficits, the innovation and talents deficits, the global image and brand. On the other hand, you can say how fantastic that Auckland, given its size, its location and the challenges, is doing well on all of these, and what huge potential we have to grow this. So overall, if you look at how Auckland's doing, we might say highly attractive and livable in the ways I've just explained. The governance reform is working. The major planning effort that David described is now complete, but there are some obvious weaknesses. Infrastructure, business investment brand, incentive structure for target industries, investment in commercialization of the knowledge base, low level of instruments for finance at the moment, and the threat of those things I warned you about. Population growth without job growth and infrastructure pickup, or the missed opportunity to not attract private investment because it's not aware, or perception of a slow pace of change. So this is the big question I'm trying to answer. Is the investment system the key issue in Auckland or not? I think in part it is. I think the investment system that you have has prevented infrastructure, incentives, commercialisation and promotion of the city happening in the way it needs to happen. I think it prevents flexibility and integration of the investment system. You've got those two separated pieces that we talked about. I think it prevents you at the moment from the ability to capture growth and recycle investment properly from it. I think that central government is very dominant, and as I've said, that's not always a bad thing. But unless central government is therefore absolutely recruited to the Auckland agenda, that dominance becomes a weakness where it could be a strength. And then you've got these separated roles between the finances of the city and the central government, which in the current moment don't really work, because nearly all the challenges cities have to solve require a combination of national and local efforts. So the Auckland and New Zealand system of finance and governance only works if it's really embedded with a series of very deep and intense joint ventures between local and national government. And if those joint ventures are absent, the system, this separated system of finance is a disability to you. Now, investment's not the only story. Size, location, the interaction of Auckland with the rest of the world, its visibility, its identity, its buzz, its density, its entrepreneurship. Those are all things that don't just require investment. You can improve those in other ways. But I think underlying that is a conversation to be had about the appetite in Auckland to really challenge this. We'll come back to that. Of course, there are some causal relationships between these two different groups. Visibility affects how investors look at Auckland. The scale of the opportunities is a function of size as well as how you prepare the opportunities. Does Auckland have clarity of purpose around this? So what have some other cities done that have been useful or worthwhile when faced with some of these similar challenges? I'll talk very briefly, firstly, about Boston. This is a great example of a city that 30 years ago was considered very much on the brink. Boston was going backwards and downwards. And what they've done very successfully here is to leverage their land assets through the Boston Redevelopment Authority to create new urban and innovation districts. The story in Bilbao, another high quality of life city, is about joint ventures between national, regional, county and local government around a redevelopment program where all of the public land assets were put together in one portfolio and leveraged very effectively for everything you know about Bilbao's story of regeneration, the Guggenheim and the Bondi Barra district and the new image of the city. Been very successfully introduced themselves to the world as a different kind of city. In Vienna, the Vienna Holding Company is effectively the off-balance sheet financial powerhouse of the city, holding more than 17 different city entities off the balance sheet, off the public and private, the regulated part of the system, and enabling the Vienna Holding Company, therefore, to become very much involved in investing, for example, in affordable housing, which has been the key thing that they've done over the last period of time. That's been very important. In Toronto, an initiative a bit like the one we're launching here today was taken in 2008. A group of business leaders got together to help the government think about how to consolidate the fiscal capabilities of the city and to improve its competitiveness. And they really have developed a new way of thinking about the city's capital budgets, a new way of thinking about their physical assets, and a new way of turning revenue into capital, which again we could discuss later. Creating new tools, the second idea. Manchester has just negotiated with the British government one of those centralised financial systems, what's called an earn-back scheme, which is in a sense on the basis of improved growth performance, allowing Manchester to retain more of the upside in terms of the tax revenues produced, as long as that upside is then invested in critical infrastructure projects that will spur and encourage growth. In other words, a deal that's outside of the existing system, a separate deal around growth and reinvestment. That's been important. Hafen City in Hamburg, a long-term investment fund created 30 years ago to invest in the city's assets, to build a return on them, public and private, put together as a long-term vehicle, which has been hugely successful in their waterfront regeneration. In Turin, when they introduced directly elected city mayors in the early 90s, they allowed directly elected city mayors to use new fiscal and financial tools, and in particular long-term infrastructure bonds. So in Turin, as part of the lead-up to the 2006 Olympics, that some of you may remember, they subterraneanized all of the infrastructure, engaged in large-scale redevelopment, all using new governance to create new fiscal powers. Zurich's been very effective in attracting complete private sector sponsorship into its city lighting, for example. This is a very common tool now to get private sector sponsorship into lighting, to public space, a range of other public amenities, and it's been very attractive. Moscow has attracted now the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority to invest in new infrastructure in the city, particularly the ring road, the high-speed rail line, and the overhaul of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So that again is attracting this capital in. Manchester Airport's created a new business district using Chinese capital from CIC. And Amsterdam has really led the way in attracting institutional capital into large-scale affordable housing blocks, 500, 1,000, 2,000 blocks of affordable housing in a high-growing, high-quality-of-life city. So I need to stop really now to have the conversation with you. So instead of running through all of this, I'm just going to jump to my last slide and say I think there are probably 5 tactics that work in this area. The first one is that we have to demonstrate that any city is using the existing tools and systems as much as it can, and it has its attention focused on how to improve them. That seems to me to be very key to making the case. The second thing is to develop a small number of new initiatives that seem to be fruitful or have potential, and really test scenarios for them, both in terms of the local impact and the national impact, and try to build around tools that will have beneficial impacts locally and nationally. The third thing, particularly given the New Zealand system of public finance, is to create new joint ventures between Auckland and central government. That has to be right at the heart of it, seems to me. The fourth thing is probably to focus on a single set of preferred changes that make a clear proposition. In other words, you do need a joined-up voice for Auckland here. And then you need to get people behind the proposed changes. So we're thinking about how these other cities made changes happen. It was some version of these tactics. And there I'll stop, if I may.